The most expensive mistake in business is not trusting the wrong numbers. It is underestimating the right person. On the 42nd floor of the Grand Harbor Hotel overlooking downtown Chicago, preparations for one of the largest business meetings of the year were already underway. The private conference restaurant had been reserved exclusively for executives, investors, and international partners. Crystal glasses reflected the afternoon sunlight. White tablecloths stretched across the room like untouched sheets of snow. Every detail had been carefully arranged because a $6.8 billion acquisition agreement was expected to be finalized before sunset. At the center of it all stood Jonathan Pierce. At 64 years old, he was one of the most recognized business leaders in America. Financial magazines called him visionary. Television networks called him unstoppable. Competitors called him dangerous. Jonathan preferred a simpler description. He believed he was usually the smartest person in the room. That belief had helped him build an empire worth billions. It had also become a habit. Several floors below, Emily Carter adjusted the sleeve of her uniform before beginning her shift. At 32, she had worked at the hotel restaurant long enough to know how high-pressure events operated. Wealthy clients came and went. Executives celebrated victories and quietly discussed failures. Emily rarely paid attention to titles. She focused on people. That was one reason guests often requested her section. She listened carefully. She stayed calm under pressure. And unlike many others, she never seemed impressed by status. By late afternoon, the conference dining area was filled with activity. Advisors reviewed presentations. Lawyers checked documents. Senior executives moved between tables carrying tablets and folders. Emily and the restaurant staff worked quietly around them. The atmosphere felt electric. One signature could change entire industries. Jonathan arrived shortly before the meeting began. Conversations immediately shifted toward him. Several executives stood to greet him. Investors smiled. Assistants rushed to accommodate last-minute requests. Jonathan accepted the attention without hesitation. He was accustomed to it. As he reviewed documents near the head table, Emily approached carrying a tray of coffee cups. One of Jonathan's senior analysts accidentally knocked a folder toward the edge of the table. Several pages slid loose and drifted onto the floor. Emily quickly stepped forward and caught one before it disappeared beneath a chair. "Thank you," the analyst said. Emily glanced at the page before returning it. It happened so quickly that most people would not have noticed. But one number immediately stood out. A projected revenue figure appeared inconsistent with the surrounding calculations. Emily said nothing at first. It was not her meeting. Not her responsibility. She returned to serving coffee. Yet the number stayed in her mind. 10 minutes later, Jonathan began reviewing the same documents with several investors seated nearby. Emily happened to be refilling water glasses when she saw the page again. The discrepancy was still there. Small enough to overlook. Large enough to matter. She hesitated. Then she made a decision. "Excuse me," she said politely. The conversation stopped. Several executives looked up. Jonathan barely glanced in her direction. "What is it?" Emily pointed carefully toward the report. "I may be mistaken, but I think that projection might not match the quarterly figure listed 2 pages earlier." Silence settled over the table. One analyst frowned. Another checked the document briefly. Jonathan looked at Emily as though she had interrupted a private conversation between surgeons. "You think there is an error?" he asked. "I am not sure," Emily replied calmly. "I only noticed the numbers seemed different." A few people exchanged uncertain glances. Jonathan took the report and scanned the page. After several seconds he closed the folder. "You are a waitress," he said. His voice was not loud. Yet everyone heard it. "Perhaps leave financial analysis to professionals." The room became uncomfortably still. Emily remained composed. "Of course," she said quietly. But Jonathan was not finished. A faint smile crossed his face. "It is remarkable how often people mistake confidence for expertise." A few nervous laughs emerged from around the table. Jonathan leaned back in his chair. "Next time focus on the coffee. Not the numbers." Then came the word that would change everything. "Do not be stupid." The laughter disappeared instantly. Emily stood motionless for a second. No anger crossed her face. No embarrassment. No argument. She simply nodded once and continued serving the table as though nothing had happened. Yet several people in the room noticed something Jonathan did not. She had not looked hurt. She had looked disappointed. And as the meeting continued toward the biggest deal of Jonathan Pierce's career, nobody realized that a single overlooked number was already waiting quietly beneath the surface. Emily Carter finished refilling the water glasses and moved quietly toward the service station. Around her, conversations slowly resumed. Executives returned their attention to charts and forecasts. Investors reviewed printed reports. The moment seemed to disappear almost as quickly as it had happened. Yet not everyone had forgotten it. Several people seated near Jonathan Pierce exchanged subtle glances. One analyst looked back at the page Emily had mentioned. Another reopened a spreadsheet on his tablet. Nobody spoke about it openly. Not yet. Jonathan, meanwhile, continued leading the discussion with the confidence that had defined his entire career. Numbers appeared on large presentation screens. Growth projections stretched across multiple markets. Revenue forecasts promised extraordinary returns. The $6.8 billion acquisition seemed increasingly inevitable. Every slide reinforced the same conclusion. Success was only a signature away. Across the room, Emily focused on her work. She carried trays. Collected empty cups. Assisted guests. If anyone expected her to react emotionally to Jonathan's insult, they were disappointed. Her expression remained calm. Professional. Controlled. Yet beneath that calm exterior, her mind continued returning to the same figure she had noticed earlier. The discrepancy still bothered her. Not because she wanted to prove herself right. Because numbers rarely become less important when ignored. Near the back of the room, one of the junior analysts quietly approached another member of the finance team. "Can you check something for me?" he whispered. The second analyst frowned. "What?" The first pointed toward a page on his tablet. The revenue projection for the Southwest Division. The second analyst reviewed the figure. At first nothing seemed unusual. Then his expression changed slightly. "Where did this come from?" "The acquisition packet." "That cannot be right." The first analyst glanced toward Jonathan. "That is what I thought." Within minutes, a small cluster of finance specialists had begun reviewing supporting documents. The process remained discreet. Nobody wanted to interrupt the meeting without certainty. Yet uncertainty was already spreading. One calculation led to another. One report referenced another report. Numbers that initially appeared solid began raising questions. Jonathan noticed none of it. Standing near the presentation screen, he was explaining long-term expansion strategies to a group of international investors. His voice carried authority. His confidence filled the room. For decades that confidence had been enough. Tonight, however, confidence was beginning to compete with mathematics. Emily happened to pass a nearby table carrying fresh coffee when she noticed the analysts reviewing documents with increasing urgency. She immediately recognized the page they were studying. The same page she had referenced earlier. She continued walking without slowing down. It was not her place to interfere again. Several minutes later, one of the analysts finally stood and approached Jonathan. "Excuse me." Jonathan paused mid-sentence. "Yes." The analyst hesitated. There may be a small inconsistency in one of the projected revenue schedules. The room grew quieter. Jonathan accepted the document with visible impatience. What kind of inconsistency? We are still verifying. Jonathan glanced briefly at the page before handing it back. Then verify it. A few nervous smiles appeared around the room. The meeting resumed. Yet the atmosphere had changed. The certainty that existed an hour earlier no longer felt quite as solid. Investors began paying closer attention. Advisors whispered among themselves. Questions emerged that had not existed before. Jonathan sensed the shift but interpreted it as ordinary caution. He had survived far more difficult negotiations. What he did not realize was that the issue extended beyond a single figure. The number Emily had noticed was connected to multiple valuation models throughout the acquisition package. If the foundation was wrong, everything built upon it would require review. Near sunset, golden light poured through the towering windows overlooking Chicago. The city glowed beneath the fading sky. Inside the conference restaurant, tension continued rising one careful calculation at a time. Emily stood near the service station organizing glasses when she overheard a finance director quietly say 4 words that changed the mood entirely. "We need another audit." The sentence was barely above a whisper. Yet it carried the weight of millions of dollars. Across the room, Jonathan Pierce remained focused on closing the deal of a lifetime. But somewhere beneath the polished presentations and confident speeches, the first crack had already appeared. And the person who noticed it first was the one everyone had been too quick to dismiss. The request for another audit changed everything. Not immediately. Not dramatically. The meeting did not stop. Nobody stood up from the table. No alarm sounded. Yet the atmosphere inside the private conference restaurant shifted in a way every experienced executive could feel. Confidence had been replaced by caution. Questions had replaced assumptions. The $6.8 billion acquisition was no longer moving forward at full speed. It was slowing down. And in deals of that size, even a small delay could become expensive. Jonathan Pierce remained outwardly composed. He had spent decades navigating complex negotiations. One discrepancy in a financial packet did not concern him. At least that was what he told himself. Proceed with the review, he instructed his finance team. We will continue with the presentation. Several investors nodded politely. Others remained focused on their documents. A few began whispering to advisors seated beside them. The energy in the room felt different now. Less enthusiastic. More analytical. Across the dining area, Emily Carter continued serving guests. She moved quietly between tables carrying coffee and bottled water. The executives barely noticed her anymore. Most were now focused on the growing uncertainty surrounding the numbers. Emily preferred it that way. She had no desire to become part of the story. Yet as she passed one table, she overheard fragments of conversation. The valuation model references the same figure. If that number changes, projections change. How did nobody catch this? The questions lingered in the air. Emily said nothing. She simply continued working. Meanwhile, in a smaller section of the conference room, 3 senior analysts had gathered around a laptop. Spreadsheets covered the screen. Financial models were being compared line by line. One analyst rubbed his forehead. Another recalculated several assumptions manually. The third stared silently at the monitor. Finally he looked up. This is bigger than we thought. The others exchanged uneasy glances. The original discrepancy was not isolated. The incorrect revenue assumption had been imported into multiple forecasting systems. Several growth projections depended on it. Multiple investor summaries referenced it. The mistake had quietly spread throughout the acquisition package like a crack hidden beneath fresh paint. One analyst immediately requested additional supporting documents. Another began contacting members of the due diligence team. For the first time that day, concern appeared on their faces. Back at the head table, Jonathan was discussing expansion opportunities with a group of international partners when his chief financial officer approached. The executive leaned down and spoke quietly. Jonathan's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Not enough for most people to notice. But enough. How serious? Jonathan asked. We are still verifying. Give me a number. The executive hesitated. Potentially very serious. Jonathan's jaw tightened. Potentially. We need more time. Time. It was the one thing nobody wanted to hear. Large acquisitions depended on momentum. Investors disliked uncertainty. Markets disliked delays. Competitors loved them. Jonathan glanced across the room toward the finance team. Their faces told him everything he needed to know. The issue was growing. As sunset approached, the Chicago skyline glowed orange and gold beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The beauty outside contrasted sharply with the tension inside. What had begun as a celebration now felt increasingly fragile. One of the lead investors finally raised a concern publicly. Before we proceed further, perhaps we should review the audit findings. The room became silent. Jonathan forced a confident smile. The findings are still preliminary. Nevertheless, the investor replied, our board will require clarification. Several others nodded in agreement. Jonathan felt control slipping away by degrees. Not dramatically. Gradually. Like sand moving beneath someone's feet. Near the service station, Emily organized clean glasses while observing none of the conversation directly. Yet she could feel the change in the room. People spoke more cautiously. Laughter had disappeared. Confidence had become calculation. At that moment, one of the junior analysts approached her unexpectedly. Excuse me, he said. Emily looked up. Yes. The analyst held the report she had referenced earlier. When you noticed this number, he paused. What exactly caught your attention? Emily glanced at the page. The answer came immediately. The growth percentage did not match the revenue increase. The analyst stared at her. You saw that in a few seconds? Emily nodded. It looked unusual. The analyst looked back toward the conference tables where executives continued debating the future of a $6.8 billion deal. Then he looked again at the waitress everyone had ignored. For the first time all evening, someone inside that room began asking a question Jonathan Pierce never considered. What if the smartest observation of the day had not come from the head of the table at all? The room had fully shifted into a state of controlled tension. What had begun as a confident presentation was now an active investigation unfolding in real time. Every executive in the private conference restaurant understood the implication. A $6.8 billion acquisition was no longer simply about growth or opportunity. It was now about accuracy, trust, and survival of the deal itself. Jonathan Pierce remained seated at the head table, but his authority no longer filled the room in the same way. He could feel it. Conversations no longer centered around his vision. They centered around the numbers. Around the inconsistency. Around the possibility that something fundamental in the financial structure might be wrong. The CFO approached him again, this time carrying printed pages marked with notes. We have traced the issue further, he said quietly. Jonathan took the pages without speaking. His eyes scanned the text. Slowly, his expression tightened. The problem was not isolated. It was systemic. A single incorrect assumption had propagated through multiple valuation layers, affecting projections across divisions. The impact was larger than anyone initially believed. Jonathan leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose. How did this survive initial review, he asked. The CFO hesitated. It appears it originated in an early-stage model before full consolidation. It was not flagged during final verification because the surrounding data appeared consistent. Jonathan's fingers tightened around the edge of the document. Consistency. The same word that had once given him confidence now felt like a warning. Across the room, Emily Carter continued her work, unaware that her earlier observation had now become the focal point of a billion-dollar disruption. She was clearing plates from a nearby table when one of the senior advisors approached her again. "Excuse me," he said. Emily paused. "Yes." The advisor lowered his voice. "The discrepancy you mentioned earlier, how certain were you?" Emily considered the question carefully. "I was not certain," she said. "I just noticed it did not align with the rest of the report." The advisor nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already suspected. "And you decided to speak up anyway?" Emily met his eyes. "If something looks wrong, it should be checked." There was no hesitation in her answer. No attempt to justify herself beyond simple logic. The advisor looked back toward the main table where Jonathan was still reviewing documents. "You realize that one observation has now triggered a full audit?" Emily gave a small, neutral nod. "Then it was worth checking." The advisor did not respond immediately. He simply walked away, returning to the cluster of executives now gathered around revised projections. The atmosphere inside the room continued to tighten. Analysts worked faster. Lawyers re-examined clauses. Investors whispered in low, urgent tones. The deal that had once seemed inevitable was now suspended in uncertainty. Jonathan finally stood from his seat. The room quieted almost instantly. He held the report in his hand, looking across the table at his team. "I want every assumption verified," he said firmly. "No exceptions." His voice carried authority, but there was a new undertone beneath it. Not confidence. Control. Effort to regain control. As the team dispersed to execute his instructions, Jonathan's gaze shifted across the room. It eventually landed on Emily, who had returned to the service station and was calmly organizing clean glassware. She did not look back at him. She did not need to. In Jonathan's mind, something had already begun to reframe itself. The issue was no longer just a financial discrepancy. It was the realization that the person who first identified it had been dismissed without consideration. That thought lingered longer than any spreadsheet or forecast. The evening outside the windows deepened into night. Chicago's skyline shimmered with steady lights, indifferent to the tension inside the room. But within the conference restaurant, the energy had permanently changed. The deal was no longer moving forward smoothly. It was being examined, questioned, and potentially dismantled piece by piece. And for the first time since the meeting began, Jonathan Pierce found himself asking a question he rarely allowed in his world of billion-dollar decisions. What else had he overlooked because he assumed he already knew enough? By 8:30 that evening, the private conference restaurant no longer resembled the confident celebration it had been just hours earlier. The polished atmosphere remained. The skyline still glittered beyond the glass walls. Crystal glasses still reflected the warm golden lighting. Yet beneath the elegant surface, the mood had fundamentally changed. Teams of analysts were now working from temporary stations created around dining tables. Laptops covered every available surface. Financial reports were spread across white tablecloths. Conversations happened in urgent whispers instead of confident predictions. The $6.8 billion acquisition had entered dangerous territory. Jonathan Pierce stood near the windows overlooking downtown Chicago. His reflection stared back at him from the glass. For years he had trusted his instincts almost as much as he trusted numbers. Tonight both seemed less reliable than usual. Behind him, members of the finance team continued reviewing projections. The deeper they looked, the more questions appeared. What had originally seemed like a single discrepancy was now revealing weaknesses throughout the valuation structure. Some assumptions could be corrected. Others would require complete revision. Time was becoming the enemy. One of the lead investors approached Jonathan with a serious expression. "Our board is requesting a delay." Jonathan turned slowly. "A delay? Until independent verification is complete." Jonathan folded his arms. "The review is already underway. That is not the issue." The investor paused carefully. "Confidence is." Those words hit harder than any spreadsheet. Confidence. Once lost, it was difficult to recover. Especially in transactions measured in billions. Across the room, Emily Carter was helping staff prepare additional coffee service. Many of the executives had now been working continuously for hours. Fatigue was beginning to show. Despite the growing tension around her, Emily remained focused on her responsibilities. She moved between tables with the same calm professionalism she had shown all day. Several members of the finance team had started acknowledging her politely when she passed. Some even thanked her. The change was subtle, but noticeable. Earlier that afternoon she had been invisible. Now people were paying attention. Not because of her position. Because of her observation. One of the younger analysts approached her while waiting for fresh coffee. "Can I ask you something?" Emily smiled politely. "Sure." The analyst looked almost embarrassed. "Do you have a background in finance?" Emily shook her head. "No, accounting. No, economics." Emily smiled slightly. "No," the analyst looked genuinely confused. "Then how did you notice the issue?" Emily thought for a moment. "My father was an engineer." "An engineer?" She nodded. "He used to tell me that numbers should tell the same story no matter where you find them." The analyst stared at her for a second. "That is actually good advice." Emily laughed softly. "He thought so." The conversation ended there, but the analyst walked away with a different understanding than before. Sometimes expertise did not arrive wearing the title people expected. Back near the conference tables, the independent review team delivered preliminary findings. The results were worse than anticipated. Several projected growth assumptions lacked sufficient support. Revenue forecasts would require significant revision. Market risk had been underestimated in multiple sectors. The room grew increasingly quiet as the findings were explained. Nobody needed to say what everyone was thinking. The acquisition package was no longer strong enough to move forward without substantial changes. Jonathan listened without interrupting. Each new finding added weight to the realization forming in his mind. Earlier that day he had dismissed a concern simply because of who raised it. Not because the concern lacked merit. Because he believed expertise belonged to certain people and not others. That realization was becoming impossible to ignore. The lead investor finally stood from his chair. Several others followed. "We will need to suspend final approval," he said. "Until all revisions are completed." The word settled heavily across the room. Suspension was not cancellation. But it was close enough to feel dangerous. Months of preparation now faced uncertainty. Millions of dollars in immediate costs would follow. Market reactions would come soon after. Jonathan remained silent as the investors slowly gathered their materials. One by one, conversations ended. Chairs emptied. Advisors departed. The momentum that had carried the deal all year was evaporating in real time. Across the room, Emily continued arranging coffee cups for guests who were already preparing to leave. She showed no sign of satisfaction. No sense of victory. To her, nothing had changed. A mistake had been found. People were dealing with it. That was all. Yet as Jonathan watched her from across the room, he understood something that made the evening feel even heavier. The biggest problem in the deal was no longer the numbers. It was the moment he chose arrogance over curiosity. And that mistake was proving far more expensive than any spreadsheet error. The conference restaurant was nearly empty by 10 o'clock that night. Most investors had already left. Advisors gathered their materials and departed in small groups. The energy that had once filled the room had faded into exhaustion. Outside, Chicago shimmered beneath a dark sky, its lights reflected across the river like scattered pieces of gold. Inside, the remains of a $6.8 billion opportunity sat buried beneath stacks of reports and unanswered questions. Jonathan Pierce remained alone near the windows long after many others had gone home. His jacket rested across the back of a chair. Several financial summaries remained spread across the table before him. Yet he was no longer studying numbers. He was thinking about moments. One comment. One assumption. One decision made in less than 30 seconds. Across the room, Emily Carter continued helping close the restaurant. Chairs were returned to their proper places. Glassware was polished. Tables were reset for the next day. Her routine remained unchanged despite everything that had happened around her. That was what struck Jonathan most. Everyone else had been affected by the collapse in momentum. Analysts looked stressed. Executives looked frustrated. Investors looked cautious. Emily looked exactly the same. Calm. Focused. Unmoved by either praise or criticism. Earlier that afternoon he had publicly dismissed her. Now multiple senior members of his own team were discussing her observation as the turning point of the entire review process. The contrast was becoming impossible to ignore. One of Jonathan's senior advisors approached carrying a folder. The latest findings are in. Jonathan accepted the report. And? The advisor sat down heavily. The independent review confirmed the issue. Jonathan remained silent. Several assumptions were overstated. Not intentionally. But enough to change the risk profile. Jonathan nodded slowly. The answer no longer surprised him. How bad? The advisor exhaled. Bad enough that no board will approve the acquisition this week. Silence followed. Beyond the windows, traffic moved through downtown Chicago. The city continued its rhythm without concern for billion-dollar negotiations. Jonathan looked toward the empty investor tables. Months of work had led to this evening. Hundreds of meetings. Thousands of pages. Countless hours of preparation. Yet one overlooked inconsistency had exposed weaknesses nobody expected. The advisor followed Jonathan's gaze. You know, he said carefully, the waitress may have saved us. Jonathan looked at him. Saved us? Imagine if the acquisition closed first. The advisor leaned forward. Imagine finding these issues afterward. Jonathan understood immediately. The consequences would have been far worse. Legal complications. Shareholder concerns. Reputational damage. Financial losses extending far beyond a delayed transaction. The advisor continued. Nobody wants to hear it. But she may have prevented a disaster. Jonathan looked down at the report in his hands. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he folded the document closed. Across the restaurant, Emily was helping another employee stack menus. She had no idea the conversation was happening. No idea executives were discussing her contribution. No idea that some people now viewed her as the reason a larger crisis had been avoided. She simply continued working. Jonathan found that remarkable. Many people spent their lives seeking recognition. Emily seemed completely uninterested in it. A few minutes later, the final members of the finance team left the room. The restaurant grew even quieter. Soft music played somewhere in the distance. Employees prepared for closing. Jonathan remained seated. For the first time in years, he felt less certain about his own judgment than he did about someone else's character. Near the service station, Emily picked up a tray and began carrying empty glasses toward the kitchen. As she passed, one of the younger analysts stopped her. "Thank you," he said unexpectedly. Emily looked surprised. For what? The analyst smiled. For speaking up. Emily glanced around the nearly empty room. I only pointed out a number. Exactly. The analyst nodded once. Most people would not have. Emily smiled politely and continued walking. The conversation lasted less than 10 seconds. Yet Jonathan heard every word. And somehow those simple words carried more weight than hours of executive discussions. Because they highlighted a truth he could no longer avoid. The people he trusted most had access to extraordinary credentials, elite education, and decades of experience. Yet the person who first noticed the problem had none of those things. She simply paid attention. As the final lights began dimming across sections of the restaurant, Jonathan Pierce reached a conclusion that felt both uncomfortable and necessary. The greatest weakness in his leadership had never been financial. It had been believing wisdom always arrived wearing the title he expected. By 10:45, only a handful of employees remained inside the Grand Harbor Hotel restaurant. The conference tables had been cleared. Presentation screens were dark. Most of the executives who had spent the day discussing billions of dollars were already heading home or preparing damage control calls for the following morning. The room that had once carried the energy of ambition now carried something quieter. Reflection. Jonathan Pierce remained seated near the windows overlooking Chicago. The city lights stretched endlessly into the darkness. Usually, after a difficult day, he focused on solutions. He looked for strategies. Leverage, opportunities. Tonight felt different. His thoughts kept returning to a single moment. A woman offering a simple observation. A man dismissing it without consideration. Across the room, Emily Carter was finishing the final tasks of her shift. She checked reservations for the next morning, reviewed closing procedures, and assisted the last few employees preparing to leave. Her movements remained calm and efficient. Nothing about her behavior suggested she had influenced the outcome of one of the largest business negotiations of the year. Jonathan found that increasingly difficult to understand. Most people wanted credit. Most people wanted recognition. Emily seemed content simply knowing the truth had been noticed. Eventually Jonathan stood and walked across the nearly empty restaurant. For perhaps the first time that day, he approached her without an audience. No executives. No investors. No analysts. Just two people standing near a service station under warm evening lights. Emily looked up as he approached. Good evening, she said politely. Jonathan paused. For a moment, the billionaire who negotiated with world leaders seemed strangely uncertain about how to begin a simple conversation. Emily, he said. Do you have a minute? Of course. Jonathan glanced around the quiet room. I wanted to ask you something. She waited patiently. Why did you say anything? Emily looked slightly confused. About the report? Yes. Jonathan folded his hands in front of him. You had every reason to ignore it. Emily considered the question. Not really. Most people would have. She smiled faintly. Maybe. Jonathan studied her expression. You did not know what was at stake. No, you did not know the value of the transaction. No, you were not responsible for the outcome. No, Jonathan shook his head slightly. Then why? Emily answered without hesitation. Because it looked wrong. The simplicity of the response caught him off guard. No grand explanation. No personal agenda. No hidden ambition. Just a straightforward principle. Something appeared wrong. Therefore it deserved attention. Jonathan looked away briefly toward the windows. You know, he said quietly, people spend years trying to impress rooms like this. Emily laughed softly. I was just trying to refill water glasses. For the first time that evening, Jonathan smiled. A genuine smile. Small, but real. You may have saved us from making a very expensive mistake. Emily's expression remained unchanged. Then I am glad someone checked it. The answer carried no pride. No attempt to claim responsibility. Only relief that the issue had been addressed. Jonathan found himself respecting her more with every sentence. He spent his life around people eager to take credit for success. Emily seemed determined to avoid it. A brief silence settled between them. Then Jonathan spoke again. I owe you an apology. Emily looked surprised. Jonathan continued before she could respond. I judged you based on your position. I assumed I knew what you were capable of before I knew anything about you. Emily remained quiet. And I was wrong. The words felt unfamiliar leaving his mouth. Not because they were difficult to understand. Because they were difficult to admit. Especially for someone who had spent decades being treated as the smartest person in the room. Emily studied him for a moment before offering a gentle smile. Everyone makes assumptions. Jonathan nodded. That does not make them harmless. The answer lingered between them. For several seconds neither spoke. Then Emily surprised him. My father used to say something. Jonathan waited. He said that if someone surprises you, it usually means you are looking at them through a label instead of seeing the person. Jonathan repeated the sentence quietly to himself. The words felt uncomfortably accurate. For years he had evaluated people through titles, credentials, and positions. Yet the person who protected him from a potentially disastrous decision had not arrived carrying any of those things. She had arrived carrying a tray of coffee. As the final lights dimmed across the restaurant, Jonathan realized the lesson was no longer about a failed deal or a flawed report. It was about perspective. And for the first time in a very long time, he felt grateful that someone had challenged his without ever trying. 2. The next morning arrived with an unusual sense of clarity. The financial markets had not yet opened, but messages were already flowing across executive offices throughout the country. Analysts were preparing revised assessments. Investors were requesting updates. Legal teams were reviewing timelines. The acquisition that had once appeared inevitable now stood suspended behind layers of uncertainty. Yet inside the Grand Harbor Hotel restaurant, the atmosphere felt remarkably ordinary. Sunlight poured through the windows. Coffee machines hummed softly. Employees prepared tables for breakfast service. Emily Carter arrived for work exactly as she always did. She greeted co-workers. Reviewed reservations. Adjusted place settings. To anyone watching, it would have been impossible to guess that she had become the unexpected center of conversations occurring in corporate boardrooms hundreds of miles away. Around 9 o'clock, Jonathan Pierce entered the restaurant once again. This time there were no investors surrounding him. No advisors carrying reports. No executives competing for his attention. He walked in alone. Several employees recognized him immediately, but the energy felt different from the previous day. The image of the unstoppable billionaire had been replaced by something more human. Jonathan requested a table near the windows and sat quietly with a cup of coffee. For nearly 20 minutes he simply watched the city wake up. People crossed busy intersections. Taxis moved through traffic. Construction crews began their shifts. Life continued. Eventually Emily approached his table. Good morning, she said politely. Good morning, Jonathan replied. There was an ease in the conversation now that had not existed before. Emily offered a menu. Jonathan smiled slightly. I think I already learned enough lessons here yesterday. Emily laughed softly. Most people come here for breakfast. I came back for perspective. That answer surprised even him. Emily remained standing beside the table. Did things get worse? She asked. Jonathan considered the question carefully. In some ways. He looked out the window. The deal is officially suspended. Emily nodded. I am sorry to hear that. Are you? Jonathan asked. Not suspiciously. Genuinely curious. Emily thought for a moment. I am sorry when people work hard towards something and it falls apart. Jonathan studied her expression. There was no satisfaction in her voice. No hidden judgment. Just simple empathy. Even after yesterday? Emily smiled faintly. Especially after yesterday. Those 3 words lingered longer than Jonathan expected. For years he had measured people by performance, results, and achievement. Emily seemed to measure them by something else entirely. Character. A short time later, Jonathan received a call from one of the lead investors. He stepped away to answer it. The conversation lasted nearly 15 minutes. When he returned, his expression had changed. Not dramatically. But enough. Emily noticed. Everything okay? Jonathan sat down slowly. The board completed its review. And? Jonathan exhaled. The acquisition will not move forward. The words settled quietly between them. Months of preparation. Hundreds of meetings. Endless negotiations. Finished. Not because competitors intervened. Not because markets collapsed. Because critical assumptions failed under scrutiny. Jonathan expected the announcement to feel devastating. Instead, he felt something unexpected. Relief. Emily seemed to sense it. You are not as upset as I expected. Jonathan nodded slowly. Neither am I. He looked down at the coffee cup in front of him. Yesterday I thought I was losing a deal. His eyes moved toward the skyline. Now I realize I was avoiding a much bigger mistake. Emily sat across from him for a moment, despite normally never sitting with guests. The restaurant was quiet. There was time. Jonathan continued. Do you know what the investor told me? Emily shook her head. He said the review probably saved billions in future losses. Emily smiled gently. Then maybe the delay was not a failure. Jonathan laughed softly. That sounds suspiciously wise for someone I called stupid. The words hung in the air. Emily looked at him. Then she smiled. Not because the memory was pleasant. Because the honesty mattered. For the first time, Jonathan had said it without defensiveness. Without excuses. Just truth. Outside, sunlight reflected from the buildings across the river. Inside, something else had become clear. The suspended acquisition was no longer the story. The real story was how quickly certainty can become blindness when mixed with pride. And how sometimes the person who changes the outcome of a billion-dollar decision is the one nobody bothers to listen to until it is almost too late. The conversation stayed with Jonathan Pierce long after he left the restaurant that morning. Throughout the following week, meetings continued. Revised reports circulated. Analysts rebuilt financial models. Investors evaluated alternatives. News of the suspended acquisition spread through business circles faster than anyone expected. Commentators speculated. Competitors celebrated quietly. Market observers searched for explanations. Yet Jonathan found himself paying less attention to public reactions than he normally would. His focus had shifted somewhere else entirely. One afternoon, while reviewing updated projections in his office overlooking Lake Michigan, he noticed something unusual. Every major discussion now began with a different question. Not how quickly a deal could be completed. Not how much profit could be generated. But whether the underlying assumptions had been challenged thoroughly enough. The change was subtle, yet profound. Several members of his leadership team noticed it as well. During one meeting, a junior analyst questioned a forecast prepared by a senior executive. Months earlier, the room might have fallen silent. Instead, Jonathan encouraged the discussion. The forecast was reviewed. A weakness was identified. The model improved. As the meeting ended, one executive remarked that the company culture felt different. Jonathan agreed. For years he had believed leadership meant having answers. Now he was beginning to understand that leadership also meant creating space for questions. A few days later, he returned to the Grand Harbor Hotel one final time. There was no business reason for the visit. No negotiations. No investors. No contracts. He simply wanted to finish a conversation that had started. Unexpectedly, Emily Carter was working a lunch shift when she saw him enter. This time she smiled immediately. "Back again?" she asked. Jonathan laughed softly. "I am starting to think this restaurant is more educational than some boardrooms." Emily guided him to a table near the window. The city stretched beyond the glass beneath a bright afternoon sky. For a while they spoke about ordinary things. The weather. The city. Family traditions. Simple conversations that rarely happened in Jonathan's world of acquisitions and quarterly reports. Eventually he reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small card. He placed it on the table. Emily looked at it but did not pick it up. "What is it?" she asked. "An invitation," Jonathan said. "Not a job offer." Emily raised an eyebrow. Jonathan smiled. "I learned my lesson." She laughed. "Good." Jonathan continued. "It is an invitation to speak to our leadership team someday. About observation. About assumptions. About paying attention." Emily looked genuinely surprised. "Why would they want to hear from me?" Jonathan leaned back slightly. "Because the most important lesson our company learned this year did not come from a consultant, an economist, or an executive." Emily glanced toward the window. "I am not sure I would know what to say." Jonathan nodded. "That is probably exactly why they should hear it." The conversation ended with a handshake. Nothing dramatic. No grand announcement. No life-changing transformation. Just mutual respect between two people who had entered the same room from very different worlds and left it with a deeper understanding of both themselves and each other. As Jonathan walked toward the exit, he paused briefly and looked back. Emily had already returned to helping customers. She was smiling as she delivered a tray to a family seated nearby. The moment felt strangely fitting. She had never been interested in status. She had never been interested in recognition. She simply treated each person in front of her with equal attention. Jonathan stepped outside into the afternoon sunlight and realized that the suspended acquisition was no longer the event he would remember most from that year. What remained with him was a far simpler lesson. Intelligence does not announce itself through titles. Wisdom does not depend on position. And sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the very person capable of preventing the costliest mistake in the room. The deal had been lost. The lesson had not. And in the end, that lesson proved far more valuable than $6.8 billion.